Hi, I'm John Green, and this is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about the sexual revolution of the 1960s. It was a time of great turbulence in American history. It witnessed free love, tie-dye, LSD trips, black power, and a lot else, including the civil rights movement, the student movement, the counterculture movement, the anti-war movement. This decade was one that would forever change our society at its roots. Today, we're going to focus specifically on the women's and gay rights movement. But before that, I'm just going to set the stage and give some context and talk about the inspiration for the movements. By far, the most important and most influential group at the time was the American youth. Because of the baby boom of the late 40s, during which the crude birth rate went up 6.2 points, some 7 million young adults were attending college at the time, more than there had ever been at that point. Most were from middle-class white families who, thanks to economic prosperity, could now focus on getting an education and learning about the social issues of the time. Probably the greatest influence to these youth was the civil rights movement. Growing up and witnessing the Montgomery bus boycotts, the Greensboro boycotts, Birmingham, and Selma on their televisions inspired a generation of Americans who felt isolated from their government and disappointed with adults who seemed unwilling to do anything. The inspiration led to the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1960. A SNCC organizer once stated, "We can't count on adults, as very few of them are not afraid of the tremendous pressures they will face. This leaves the young people to be the organizers, the agents of social and political change." Together with similar organizations like CORE, they launched movements such as the Freedom Rides, the Birmingham Protests, the March on Washington, and the Freedom Summer. The success of these movements and the facts that they actually led to new legislation, such as the Interstate Commerce Act, the Voting Rights Act, or the Civil Rights Act, displayed to the youth that they did in fact have a voice in their government. Soon after, American youth began to get involved in other social issues. In 1962, around 60 college students founded possibly the most important part of the youth movement, when they adopted the Port Huron Statement and formed the SDS. They wanted a democracy of individual participation, in which the individual shares in those decisions determining the quality and direction of his life. By the end of the year, their membership had grown to 8,000. With the success of the free speech movement at Berkeley in 1964, and the Vietnam War only spurring the youth activism, such as the burning of draft cards and even American flags, the movement became more and more popular. Out of this active youth came the New Left, including the SDS and organizations like it, like the Yippies or the Diggers or the Up Against the Wall and many other concerned youth. The New Left rejected mainstream America and what they called the Old Left. They spoke of a generational gap that left them isolated from their own government. As Jack Weinberg once said during the Berkeley incident, "Don't trust anyone over 30. As college students saw images of people their own age dying in a war they didn't even want to fight, and as they saw images of racial violence popping up in the news and on television, you could understand how the youth would maybe mistrust their government. They felt alienated from their country and even their own fellow Americans. These sorts of ideas soon began to sweep through the nation as many college students began to identify with this struggle. By 1967, the SDS would have over 100,000 members all across the country. With this atmosphere of radicalism and rebellion in the air, American culture was heading towards a drastic change, the counterculture movement. By the late 60s, millions of youth revolted against the traditional norms and values of their parents. Instead, they embraced sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The old American family values were dead. Marijuana, which had previously been confined to circles of jazz musicians, began to pop up in colleges all across the country, along with other stronger drugs like LSD. Along with the increase in drug use, the idea of free love took over the nation. According to Ben Stein, sex was like shaking hands and saying, "How do you do?" Casual sex with multiple partners without any strings attached became more and more common amongst college students. There was no expectation for commitment. Rock and roll became the new form of communication, according to Paul Cantor, with songs like "I Can't Get No Satisfaction" and "Honky Tonk Women" climbing the charts and blaring from the cars of young people. Ideas about sex and drugs invaded the mainstream. Movies like "I'm Curious Yellow" and "A Clockwork Orange Midnight Cowboy" explored sensuality on the silver screen, and plays like "Oh, Calcutta" and "Hair" brought nudity and sex to the stage. In "Oh, Calcutta," multiple scenes consist of nude interpretive dance, and one in particular, called "Four in the Hand," only consists of a newcomer to a masturbation game that can't think of anything to masturbate to. Clearly, American culture had done a complete 180. So there you have it. the beginnings of counterculture and youth revolt of the 60s that would change America forever. All of these feelings of rebellion and sex that captured an entire generation culminated in two major parts of the sexual revolution: feminism and the gay rights movement. Both of these groups had been shown that, just as African Americans and white middle-class Americans had, that they could fight against the man and stand up for their own rights. Additionally, the new culture, which preached free love and authenticity as two of the most important aspects of life, taught gays and women that they should not be ashamed of their sexuality, but rather embrace it.
Hey everyone, so let me take a quick poll. We all agree that women should have basic human rights, right? Perfect. Well, in fact, this is true today. It was quite the opposite in the 1960s, where women had to fight for control of their own bodies and the right to access contraception. Throughout the 1960s, feminists and liberal political groups sought equal rights in the society and culture of the United States, as well as in Congress, by seeking the passage of amendments like that of the ERA, or Equal Rights Amendment. The entire era of the 1960s saw people actively organizing and working for change. In part, this new political activism and urge to speak your mind came from this new ideology of counterculture, which was extremely prevalent throughout the 1960s and extending into the 1970s. The birth control pill and other forms of contraception, including condoms and others, became a major topic of debate throughout the decade, and brought political debate to be centered around women's rights. Also, the focus of contraception and multiple sexual partners during the sexual revolution showed that now sexual intercourse was not solely associated with reproduction, but more pleasure. By the end of the 1960s and early 70s, diaphragms, condoms, birth control, voluntary sterilization, and abortion were available to most everyone. Birth control, or the pill, came to be widely used and accepted in the 60s, with it becoming immensely popular. You can see an ad from the 60s right here. So much so that the companies were even able to advertise in public, which would never have been acceptable in the 1950s. Also, during the 1960s, the immense increase in gay and lesbian visibility through society contributed to the restructuring of social norms concerning sexuality in the United States. The main source of manpower in the sexual revolution and other movements in the 1960s was the youth, specifically the children born in the baby boom in the early 1950s, who were becoming young adults and going to college at this time. It was the children from the baby boom that promoted not only the gay liberation and feminist movements, but also counterculture and everything that it supported. Another major point of debate came to be the college campus and how the sexual revolution was affecting it. So, Mr. Green, how were college campuses affected by the sexual revolution? Well, let me tell you. As colleges began to fill with the youth from the baby boom in the 1960s, the baby boomers brought with them their ideas of counterculture and began to focus attention on political and social protest, a challenge to sexual norms established in the 50s, as well as their new ideas concerning sexual freedom, like the right to contraceptives. Some universities even began the distribution of condoms and diaphragms on campus. As well as the belief that not everyone wanted a family as soon as they could manage, they wanted to be with multiple sexual partners. College campuses were essentially concentrated small-scale versions of what a future after the sexual revolution would look like. While the sexual revolution accomplished a lot, it was, as Gene White of the Washington Herald put it, not solely verbalization. There were many other means of being heard, and this was true throughout the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution went hand in hand with feminism in the 1960s. There were many things that both had mutual interest in, and both overlapped views on topics of debate. Before the 1960s, sexism was a nameless problem, until Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, in 1963, gave it one. The feminist movement in the 1960s was much more active and able to affect the government. They were even able to pass the Equal Rights Amendment in Congress, but not the Senate. Feminism was not only important in the 60s, but severely needed. A prime example of this was that in Kennedy's cabinet, there were no females whatsoever. It was injustices like these that showed how much room there was for improvement of women's rights, not only in the government, but throughout America. The sexual revolution and feminism in the 1960s, while it did a lot for women's rights and the societal conceptions surrounding sex, there was still a lot left unfinished. Even today, we're still grappling with the intricacies of women's rights.
So, who thinks it's okay to be gay? Mr. Green, I do! Well, in the 1960s, you'd be wrong. Seriously, if you thought the women had it rough, at least they weren't arrested on a regular basis for their sexuality. Unlike the 1960s feminist movement, the 1960s homosexual movement was more about showing what was wrong and less about getting things done. A list of grievances, if you will. In the 1960s, it wasn't just unpopular to be gay, it was illegal. As one 1960s Washington Post article shows, the only place where it was legal to be gay was Illinois, and that wasn't until late 1961. Gays had long had to fight against job discrimination, especially at schools, because God forbid we let homosexuality spread to the next generation. Gays also had to endure police harassment and, in general, suffer as second-class citizens. Another example would be MLK's right-hand man, Bayard Rustin, who organized one of the most famous protests ever, the March on Washington, and helped mold MLK into a symbol of peace and nonviolence. Funny part, he was kicked out and fired because he was gay. Hi, I'm Charles Socarides, psychiatrist, and homosexuality is a mental illness which has reached epidemic proportions. I mean, really, practicing doctors showed pictures of nude males to gay men and shocked them with an electric current. The goal? Prevent them gay guys from being sexually aroused. And being famous just made life tougher. Just look at Allen Ginsberg's Howl, from which I quote, "Let them beat ass by saintly motorcyclists, and screamed with joy, who blew and were blown by those human seraphim." In case you didn't get it. Those are huge references to anal and oral sex, both illegal in the 1960s by sodomy laws that were extended to homosexuality. Ginsberg's poem received major criticism, and Ginsberg himself, a closet homosexual who was in a relationship with renowned Beats figure Neil Cassidy, Ginsberg was put on trial for spreading obscene literature. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of this poem, but whatever happened to free speech? And while this is starting to look like a rant about the injustices that gays faced in the 1960s, it's important to remember that the gay revolution in the 1960s, despite the rise of groups such as the Mattachine Societies, Radical Lesbians, and the Daughters of Bilitis, was more about embodying the wave of revolutionary counterculture to strengthen and support, rather than make bold statements. In the words of Frank Kameny, gay rights activist who led the first civil rights claim based on sexuality to the Supreme Court, the movement was unassertive, apologetic, and defensive. The 1960s, however, wasn't just a period of pamphlet spreading, horrible treatment, and clandestine meetings. In 1965 alone, there were over a dozen major picket events, notably at the White House, UN Building, and Independence Hall, which started a 5-year tradition on July 4th. The later part of the 1960s saw sit-ins at bars protesting no-service policies to gays. There were also large-scale nationwide demonstrations and even attention from the media, a CBS special, and a Time article on homosexuality. All this culminated in the Stonewall uprisings of the 1969. Credited with sparking the homosexual movement as a whole, Stonewall, a 3-day riot against police who tried to raid a gay bar, was less of the beginning and more of an explosion, a really big one. The conscious mobilization of activists led to a more militant mood embodying 20 years of discrimination and forced secrecy. And trust me, when anything's left to stew for 20 years, it can't be pretty. But what made gay rights a large-scale movement wasn't just Stonewall. It was the number of organizations that began expressing dissent as a result, including the newly formed Gay Liberation Front, which really allowed for the homosexual movement to take off. I mean, today, look how far it's come.